Business continuity and disaster recovery planning. When I ask candidates, when we sit down and discuss it, I always ask them, what domains are you really scared of? And they always come up with network security, because it is quite a complex and theoretical item that you really need practical experience to apply that. Cryptography looks like alchemy. And BCP and DRP, business continuity and disaster recovery planning, never came up. However, when I look at the mock exam results, BCP and DRP is one of the domains that people tend to do really not so good in, purely because they don't have the experience and they think it's easy. Now, the BCP and DRP domain, if we look at the business continuity and disaster recovery planning domain, it addresses the preservation of the business in the face of major disruption to normal business operations. BCP and DRP involves the preparation, the testing, and the updating of specific actions to protect critical business processes from the effects of major systems and network failures. Business continuity planning, BCP, helps to identify the organization's exposure to internal and external threats, synthesize hard and soft assets to provide the effective prevention and recovery for the organization, and maintains the competitive advantage and value system integrity. BCP counteracts interruptions to business activities and should be available to protect critical business processes from the effects of major failures or disasters. It deals with the natural and man-made events and consequences, if not dealt with promptly and effectively. The business impact analysis, or the BIA, determines the proportion of impact of an individual business unit would sustain subsequent to significant interruption of computing or telecommunication services. These impacts may be financial, in terms of monetary loss, operational, or the inability to deliver. Then the disaster recovery plans contain procedures for emergency response, extended backup operation, and post-disaster recovery. Should a computer installation experience a partial or a total loss of computer resources and physical facilities. The primary objective of disaster recovery plan is to provide the capability to process mission-essential applications in a degraded mode and return to normal mode of operation within a reasonable amount of time. Now, the candidate is expected to know the difference between BCP and DRP. Business continuity planning in terms of project scope and planning, business impact analysis, recovery strategies, recovery plan development and implementation. Moreover, the candidate should be able to understand disaster recovery in terms of recovery plan development, implementation, and restoration. This is from the Candidate Information Bulletin from IC². Now, when we look at the domain objectives, we need to look at business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning, how to prepare for adverse events through response programs focused on preserving life and business. The primary concern is life before anything else. Recovery plans to resume interrupted critical business operations. We need to look at types of sites, how we're going to test those plans as well. So the first item is on the agenda is let's look at the project scope, development, and planning. When we look at sources, there's a couple of guidelines that we can find. There's the British Standards 25999-1, which is the business continuity management part, the code of practice. The second part is the specification. And then the 25777 is the information and communication technology continuity management code of practice. Also, from an international standards point of view, we actually have the 22399 in 2007, which is a guideline for incident preparedness and operational continuity management. The ISO 24762 in 2008, which is a guideline for information and communication technology and disaster recovery services. You don't need to know these numbers for an exam. This is a guide for you, and it's actually very good if you can obtain that documentation and actually read through it as well to enhance and expand your knowledge of this topic. Then also the NIST, the NIST documentation, which is a special publication 800-34, which is contingency planning guide for federal information systems. Also the ISO 27001, section 10, Business Continuity Institute. There's a website to go visit and gain additional information if you want to. And also the Business Recovery Institute International. Also, international organization which actually has member services and information resources as well. Now, when we look at business continuity management, which is a combination of BCP, DRP, and also incident management, each section of the BCM consists of many subsections, which may vary slightly depending on the business model. This may result in possible solutions such as outsourcing and co-sourcing. Also consider a lot of technology development what we have at the moment, such as cloud computing and so on, which makes the backups quite easy, also depending on the data that you actually have. Now, when we look at BCP, you can have a business impact analysis, a risk analysis. We can look at process alternatives. So if it's a business continuity that we have to worry about, say, for example, we're in a bank and the tellers are down. So when the tellers are down, what's the process? What's our BCP? We let the tellers go to the old system, character cards, and actual paperwork. Also, incident management is closely related to BCP as well. In the DRP environment, we have issues like disaster declaration, and that's important. Alternate site migration, recovery objectives, it could be time of point, relocation to a primary site, end of disaster declaration, and lessons learned. And then incident management also dovetails into BCP and DRP, of course. However, it is an entity on its own. We've got identification of incidents, containment, resolution to make sure it's fixed, and then also analysis at the end of the day, lessons learned or root cause analysis. Now, the business continuity or the systems life cycle of a BCM includes items like business impact analysis. And within the risk analysis section, you've seen a little bit in detail how it's done. You have a risk assessment. And then after we've done that, we're going to select a business continuity management strategy. How are we going to get there? Then we're going to develop our plans. And after we've developed our plans, we're going to manage those plans by making sure they're tested and updated regularly based on our results from our tests. Critical steps that we have to do before we get to the process. We need a management commitment. And the management commitment or the buy-in is usually very difficult purely because of the fact that we're trying to sell insurance. Hopefully, what we're trying to cover won't happen. DRP champions, they are critical to make sure that the project succeeds. A champion is a person who knows the process of DRP and also the business processes inside. Project plan development, are we going to look at either software to do this? DRP business specialists as well. These are usually people that, again, like a champion, knows the business quite well and they can answer questions and understand the impact of certain scenarios. Management commits budget, one of the difficult items on the agenda. And then also from a management point of view, a steering committee, do we have a BCP and DRP policy? A policy ensures that it is actual company law and it has to be done. And if you don't do it, the measurement from the internal audit department or external audit department will make sure that it gets raised as an incident, an issue. Now, also what's very interesting and very difficult also to ascertain sometimes is the business interdependencies, whereby one department has output for another department. And if the one department with the output has a disaster, the other department expecting the input will be impacted as well. And this is known as the domino effect. Now, also from the business organizational analysis, we need a business continuity steering committee. That's where we have policy scope and authorization for certain aspects, like budgets, mandates, current and future organization. That has to be part of the development process. Interoperational dependencies. This is where we have to define our assets. When we saw risk analysis, asset identification is a very difficult process, and it changes over time as well. External dependencies, legacy systems as well. When a system gets decommissioned, can it be decommissioned? Is it still supported? How are we going to run that? Now, with a virtual environment, this has become a little bit easier compared to previously as well, because we can run legacy systems on virtual environments as well. and virtual servers and machines. The whole infrastructure allows better backups, recovery, and is really good for disaster recovery planning as well. Resource requirements, budget requirements. We have to look at the return on investment and also any legal requirements. That means if I spend the money on my DR site, is it a requirement based on business ethics, or am I a bank or critical installation which requires and has to be covered legally as well? If I don't have a backup, I might get fined and so on. Personnel availability, skeleton staff. When we consider staff going to a remote site as well, how do they get there? Is it a secure environment? Is there parking for them and so on? You've seen that from a physical security point of view as well. You'll see it later in Domain 10. Identify key personnel and alternatives, and this is where we have a selection criteria for replacement. If I don't have key personnel available due to any unforeseen circumstances, who else can do it as well? You've often seen in organizations whereby, somebody can't pay a vendor because one of the staff members on leave, so there's no alternatives. Select software tools. Specifically for large-scale implementations, it's really a big requirement. If I have numerous branches, large corporates, complex environments, software tools will help me maintain and make the plan development easier as well. Evaluate project management tool for resource requirements and also vendor resources as well. If you have a main router, a core router in your organization falling over, does a vendor have any spare parts available for me as well? Then a business impact analysis and functional requirements. When we look at this, we need to develop a BIA format. How are we going to do that? Now, numerous formats from a technical view. We need to evaluate the potential impacts of interruptions on our business. Then we have to prioritize those business functions. Then we have to differentiate between critical and non-critical systems. And there are two items when you can look at it. A recover point objective, an RPO, which means the acceptable latency of data that will not be recovered. Can we live with what amount of data not being recovered? And then also another objective is a recover time objective. This is the acceptable amount of time to restore a function. Can I be down for an hour, a week, 2 weeks? Then the business and technical requirements of those critical functions as well. Important elements for my planning, the analysis of a business. We have to identify critical business processes. Those are workflow environments, from payment of systems, input of data, how does data flow inside and outside. We have to do a threat analysis and threat modeling for our environment. Look at assets, people, processes, data and information. Then an emergency assessment. If things go wrong, what do we need to do? Critical business functions again, there could be interdependencies which can be critical. An example here is in a banking or financial environment, we have customer information file, which is critical. So it's our core file, and many systems input to that, and that outputs and it's being used by many other systems as well. So you have critical business function, this file disappears, we have huge problems. Third party or network relationship as well. Mergers and acquisitions. This impact between third-party and network relationships can be covered by contracts. Now, when we do a threat analysis, we can look at potential risk factors. Man-made. There could be sabotage. There could be riots outside the building. Information technology, systems going down. Natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes. Supply chain risk factors. This means a supply chain might not be in existence tomorrow because of the financial stress in the world at the moment. Also, they might not keep stock on hand if you require that as well. Utility failures such as my water, my electricity coming into my environment as well, and then loss of key personnel as well. Need to consider those topics. The emergency assessment contains the following. We need to look at the affected areas. What happened? Let's contain it to make sure that if we identify an incident, contain it into a certain area, make sure that it doesn't spill over to other areas as well. Triage and escalation. So do we select which systems we have to decommission or kill? or which system we can carry on, which more important, and focus on that system initially as well. Notification and alerting procedures, those are anything from other staff that has to come on site, alerting procedures that the system is down and people have to do their backouts and they do their own backups, for example. Safety and security provisions. If it's a real disaster, it could affect human beings, human lives, so we need to consider that from an emergency point of view. And then public notification procedures. There should be one person or one body in the company that is responsible for the public relationship. Detailed documentation is required for possible legal steps and possibly input to root cause analysis as well. You need to protect yourself, so anything has to be documented, people on site, who's doing what. So this is really a requirement. Detailed documentation once again. Critical business functions can have the following issues. It can have time sensitivity, how quickly I should be up, data integrity, so if it's down, we don't have input, is that an issue? Or the classification of the data as well. If it's secret data as well, how should it be protected? Where should the tapes be handled if it's really secret information? Now, when we look at critical business functions and we identify those critical business functions, there can be operational impact, financial impact, and reputational impact, such as public image. So when we look at critical business functions, and then also dependencies from these businesses, we can upstream or downstream dependencies or circular dependencies as well. So two departments work hand in hand very closely together and depending on each other's data as well. Now, when we look at third-party or network relationships, such as downstream liabilities, we have to identify potentially impacted organizations downstream where we need to give data to. Establish any compliance requirements. We may be liable for any fines. Upstream impacts, we have to identify all our third-party relationship with impact potential, and then make sure that we have service level agreements and how we can actually make sure that the disaster is covered in that. Business continuity and recovery strategy. When we look at this, we need to look at business unit priorities. We need to identify business unit priorities, critical processes in the business, infrastructure, what do we require to get up and running again, and then communication as well between all this. We have a recovery time objective, as I said earlier as well. The recovery time objective is the acceptable amount of time to restore the function. Now, you can restore the function between 2 hours or 2 days. The 2-hour uptime requirement for financial impact, it will cost you much more. Then also recovery point objective. This means that where is it acceptable, at what time is acceptable that some data is lost when we actually recover? Is it recorded on a documentation? We can actually capture it again. So those are issues that we need to consider. And then a cost-benefit analysis as well. Once again, if we need to be up and running within an hour or 24 hours a day, it has to be real time. It will be much more expensive than, say, a week later. But we need to look at the cost-benefit of that. Then when we look at recovery alternatives, we can have a multi-processing or a mirrored site. This is hot, live, real-time, and the data is always available. We've seen some mobile sites as well, cash dispensers or ATMs, mobile sites driving around, your cable, satellite service provider as well. They've got mobile lorries or trucks driving around with disposable and dishes that actually deploy as they stop. Also, a mobile site could mean that a company would come to your office with a truck loaded with hardware and software, and for you to get your processing up and running immediately from the actual mobile site as well. We have a hot site, which means that there's duplicate of the original site of the organization. A warm site, where the hardware and some data is on hand, but not the most recent copy of the data. A cold site, we've got no data and no hardware at all. A reciprocal agreement is often seen in countries in Africa, for example, whereby it is difficult to look at utilities such as power, backup strategy, and the cost of creating a complete duplicate site. reciprocal or mutual agreement means then that if I actually take my tapes from one bank, so I say bank A, I actually will then store these tapes, secured of course, at bank B, which is my opposition, to look after my tapes, and if I require them, it is in a safe storage, and I'll do the same for them. So I'll keep their tapes on site. This is a reciprocal agreement. Contingency suppliers, making sure if one of my suppliers aren't available, I can get it from somebody else, and also a service bureau, which means that I can use them to print my payroll if I can't do it internally anymore, or do some of my services that I require to do. Now, the 7 tiers of disaster recovery is defined in some of the documentation. We have 7 tiers, although tier 0, no offsite data or possibly no recovery. Then from tier 1, we're data backup with no hot site. Tier 2, data backup with hot site. We've got tier 3, which is electronic vaulting. Tier 4, point-in-time copies. Tier 5, transaction integrity. Tier 6, zero or near zero data loss. And tier 7, highly automated business integrated solution. As you can see, from tier 1 to tier 7 actually increases the capability of recovering, of course, but also increases my cost expenditure. The Computer Network Technology, CNT, has developed a scheme for categorizing recovery time and point objectives in different classes. So what they've done is define 4 classes and say how long my time objective and my point objective should be. So class 1, 72 hours to 1 week. Point objective is my last full backup less than 1 week ago. Class 2 is 24 hours. Class 3 is 15 minutes. And class 4, as you can see on both, 0 downtime, 0 loss of any data as well. Now we can have backup strategies in our environment. We can have replication of our data in real time. We can have distributed processing between different systems. Electronic vaulting or e-vaulting is the transfer of data by electronic means to a backup site as opposed to the physical shipment of tapes or disks. We've got remote journaling, which is a continuous or periodic synchronized recording of transactions data to a remote location, such as a backup strategy. So it's not a file, but the actual transaction that is journaled remotely. We have media archives, we can have tapes, we can have different type of storage area networks. There's magneto-optical disks, there's hard disks, and there are numerous technologies which you'll see later in the physical security as well. Now, also backup location and storage criteria. One of the interesting things is I've looked at some of the documentation of some of the books, and they define certain criteria such as how far should a building be? We can have on-site backups. We can have near-site or off-site. Now, off-site storage for additional documentation and supplies. Now, as I've said, some of the documentation define distance criteria. There is no distance criteria between data center and backup data centers defined. And the reason for that is we have different areas. We've got mountainous areas and so on. However, the Federal Reserve Supervisory Recommendation defines the following. We have to maintain sufficient geographically dispersed resources to meet recovery and resumption objectives. That's my RTO and RPO. Backup arrangements should be far away from the primary site as necessary to avoid being subject to the same set of risks as the primary location, and should not rely on the same infrastructure component used by the primary site. So as you can see there, flat desert, we're in Antarctica, we're in the Himalayas. There are different geographical sites as well, which means that there are different problems and the distances may vary. Also, resilience strategies within an environment. Categories to consider when we look at resilience. It can be site resilience, for example, an asset classification. The role and relative value of the proposed facility within the overall operations, very important. Corporate, governmental, or utility. It defines the asset profile and needs for measures that increase operational resiliency. IT infrastructure resilience. This means that the availability, the diversity and resiliency and redundancy of supporting infrastructure. Some items we have to investigate: electrical power, redundant communication, data services, etc. And then finally, organizational resilience. How can a company survive a disaster? A good example is that when we actually had 9/11 in New York City, of the two towers, we had some companies that were in both towers and one being the backup of the other site. Now, when we look at plan development, we need to look at emergency response procedures in the plan. We have to look at event reporting and media management in the plan, life, health, and safety. What do we do if we had a major disaster in an organization? Damage assessment. This is where risk analysis comes into play as well right in the beginning. Triage. Which systems do we get rid of? Which systems do we focus on? Escalation, in the sense of making sure that if it's a critical data point of view. Disaster declaration. And the reason why we have disaster declaration is that we have certain funds available in case of a disaster declaration as well. And this is also important later when you want to look at your insurance to recovery as well. Alerting. How do we tell staff? Activation and notification. We have to report and communicate as we recover. And then at the end of the day, we have to do a disaster revocation once we're back to normal operations. Now, personnel notification could be anything from executive succession planning. So if we don't have the CEO available, who's going to make the decisions? Who's next in charge? Executive crisis management. This is also if a board is dismissed, what are we going to do about that? Who's going to replace us? Team coordinators and teams, notification lists we have to think about, who's been identified to notify other staff, and then finally personnel notification, public relationships. So if anything happened to some of our staff, how are we going to put it out there? Alternate site consideration could be anything from utilities. Do we have enough power? Do we have more than one power grid to our data center as well? Communication. I've started a project, and I've been given a task to take over this DR for a dealer environment. And the question was posed, well, see the plan now, and I don't see any PBXs in the process of, because they're really dependent on funding clients and deals and these kind of issues. And they says, well, we'll use mobile phones. Not considering that we're actually in a bomb-proof environment and cell phones don't work. Also, part of your disaster recovery planning as well could depend on your mobile phones or your cell phones. However, when we saw the bomb explosions in London, the first thing that was done to curb the problem was to actually disable the mobile network. And there's many reasons for that. Mobile network might require, a bomb might require a signal from a mobile phone to be activated as well. And that's one of the reasons as well. So don't rely on, you have to look at all the actual backup procedures. Environmental protections could be anything from physical and also from environmental threats like water, flood, fire, and so on. Space, have we got enough people? Parking space, very silly. And then small things affect the bigger plan as well. You'll see as well when we start testing these plans how this will actually come out later in life. Critical IT and communication as well. So you need to consider these for my alternate site as well. Logistics and supplies. Personnel, materials, transportation. Do we need new printer paper? How are we going to get there? There's little things like printing paper. Is there enough facilities for the people to use? Alternate site workspace. Instead of everybody going to one building, do we have them dispersed to different sites as well? Because mobile telecommunication and mobile computing is a big and an effective solution as well, but also depending on what the threat was. Personnel support and welfare. If some lives were lost, how are we going to support the family of the people? Remote worker environment activation as well. Now suddenly I've got people working from home, which is not normally the case. Emergency fund access, that is for staff. If I can't run my payroll, how do I get that? Do I talk to the bank? And then also additional contingencies, family responsibilities. And then possibly you may have fraud and looting take place as well. When we look at our documentation, that's our business continuity and disaster recovery plans. There should be an activity and status reporting. There should be one of the components within our documentation to say who do we do the reporting to and so on, how often should be done as well. Issue identification and resolution reports, checklists, and also recover deactivation plans as well. Now, when we look at these documentation, one of the questions I've seen posed as well, how often should DR plans be updated? And some of the documentation defines at least annually. Now, this is much really a sector standard. However, as we know these days, is that changes are quite common, regular, and it has huge impact. And what we actually try to tell the guys as well, when you actually develop your change control procedure within your CAB, your change advisory board, those documentation that you have to fill in, make sure that there's a checklist, a checkbox that says, is this change large enough to identify and notify areas such as backup strategy, education and training, DRP, etc. So you must make sure that these are all included as well. When we look at the implementation, test plans, we have explicit test objectives and success criteria. So if you go and do a test plan, you go ahead and say, listen, we're going to call a disaster, and it could be anything like a hole in the ground, or my air conditioning system has failed and the water has started leaking on top of my minis, and now I don't have internet banking. So there's certain 6 test objectives and success criteria. Test details, what we're going to do, how often do we do these tests as well from a schedule point of view. And when it's completed, we need to do a post-test review to make sure that we've done things adequately. Are there anything that we could have done better? And then finally, here from a test plan point of view, who should be involved in the test development? We can have a business continuity steering committee. We see that they dependent on budget identification, policy development, and so on. A DRP manager and also technical users, the champions I've referred to before. And the types of tests includes checklists or desk check. So we can sit all around the table and go through a checklist to make sure that we've done that. And this is the first step we usually do to make sure that the plans that have been developed are adequately at least. Then a structured walkthrough, it can be seen as an actual test for sign-off. So this is where we have a scenario simulation where we say, we have a hole in the ground, what do we do? So we go through a whole structured walkthrough of the whole test to make sure everything is fine. Simulation, we can have specialized software or neural network analysis applications to determine the impact and test disaster plans. We can have parallel testing, so we have 2 different systems running at the same time, making sure that the new one, either for software testing or DR testing, is running adequately, and then full interruption as well. However, with a full interruption, we must make sure that problems with many systems exist that it may not recover from a full interruption. For example, your hard drives could have been running for years, and now suddenly you switch it off and it doesn't want to switch back on as well. With a full interruption, you just make sure that your backups have been tested adequately. Now, also after the test, we can look at some follow-ups. Deficiencies. What did we miss? If we did address the problem, as I said earlier as well, the example could be within your change control documentation, they should address backups, DRP, backup, and training. Plan assessments. Does the plan fit our needs? If not, let's update the plan based on the test results. Then after that, schedule the next test. If the test was a fail, then make sure that the tests are very quickly scheduled in a short period of time. Now, also some recovery procedures. We can have local recovery procedures, making sure that we're still on the primary site. We can go to an alternate site migration. When we do that, also from a recovery procedure, prioritization validation, meaning that things that are more important should be recovered first. If item B is dependent on item A's output, make sure that item A is recovered first. Transfer and recovery of your data. Did we have any transactions happening in the meantime? Should we actually recover the differences as well? And then finally, if we need certification and accreditation, we need to go through the process again to make sure that our new site or recovered site is based on the best practices and standards required. And then audit the insurance or effect of BCP and DR capabilities. So this is it. So audit should be there to make sure that what is signed off correctly as well. It measures our compliance and may lessen our insurance premium. When we look at restoration, we can talk about the primary location. But do we go back to the primary location? If it was a hole in the ground, we may use our new site as the new primary site and wait to and make a decision based on that. Also, procurement supports recovery activities, new workstations, new servers. Also, does the DR plans contain a clause for funds, meaning that procurement may have special rights to purchase new items due to the fact that it is a disaster. Also, the consolidation of acquisition and disposition. After we've bought stuff and got rid of some stuff, when we get rid of the old machines that were part of the disaster, we must make sure that the disposition is done correctly as well, as we saw previously from, or you will see later in the physical security as well, and operational as well, in the sense of destruction of the data on the disk and so on. Those are important. Reporting of restoration costs, we can align that with a budget and also input for insurance purposes as well. Now, data recovery is a reversal procedures of the actual disaster recovery procedure. The business process recovery point, we need to look at journal and process synchronization, means that if we ran any transactions since a disaster was declared, we migrated to the alternate site. We ran transactions there, so we actually recover the primary site from backup tapes. However, there were some transactions that took place. We must make sure that we have process synchronization. Once we relocate to the primary site, we can do restoration order and prioritization, and then finally end of disaster declaration. Now, the feedback and plan management. After this, we have to have the identification and remediation of plan gaps. So we have to update our plans. Lessons learned. What can we do better next time? Can we do it quicker? Very small items as well. Update those plans. Perform metric review. Now, the performance metric review is actually the measurement of how quick we were. Were we inside the service level agreement? Then we have to do a plan review and make adjustments to make sure that we actually can do better. Training of key personnel based on the updated plans. And then finally, the communication. We need to distribute those plans again and a communication of plan to the stakeholders. And then finally, a post-mortem is, what did we learn from the process? What will we need to do to ensure that we can perform this better in the future? Can we avoid the disaster in the future altogether? What could have been done differently as well? And then finally, our root cause analysis for documentation.